Welcome to Fast Talk, the Velo News podcast and everything you need to know to ride like a pro.
Hello and welcome to Fast Talk. I'm Chris Case, managing editor of Velo News, joined as always by my sometimes effervescent, sometimes stoic co-host, Coach Trevor Connor. Peaking. It's that elusive target we all strive for, to be on our best form right when our target race comes around. We build plans for it, we follow 6-week guides we find online, and yet too often we find our best legs for the training race the week before the big event, or wake up the morning of our target race with flat legs. Perhaps it's so elusive because peaking is both a science and an art. What we discovered over the course of this podcast is that the two don't seem to get along with one another. Some of that has to do with the fact that science lays out a very specific 4-week plan for peaking, while the art says that it is very individual. Even among those who understand the science, it appears what they do is different. In today's episode, we'll first discuss the science of peaking, including how long it takes, why we do a fatigue block to start the peak, and the science of what happens physiologically to produce the peak. Next, we'll discuss how the top athletes peak and why it doesn't seem to agree with the science. Then we move on to why the art of peaking says something different from the science and what you should be considering when you are getting ready for your target event. From there, we'll take a deep dive into how to peak, how long to taper, how to taper, what to do right before the event, and what are the biggest mistakes you can make. Finally, we'll give you Colby's 6 tips on preparing for an event. There's your hint on our guest today. He knows a ton about peaking both as a coach and as an athlete. He's an hour record holder, an Olympian, a thinker, a tinkerer, someone with massive amounts of experience as an athlete and coach. Colby Pearce, he has many qualifications that are too long to list here, so we'll let him detail them in a minute. Also sharing his thoughts, we have Robert Pickles, the illustrious Mr. Pickles, the head physiologist at Pearl Izumi. He'll talk about the physiology of a peak and why he thinks it's all about balance. We'll also hear from Joe Dombrowski, a World Tour rider with EF Education First Drapac, who'll share what it's like to peak for an event at the highest levels. So, sit back, put your feet up, find the nearest sensory deprivation chamber. Let's make you fast. Today's episode of Fast Talk is sponsored by Ceres, makers of PowerTap power meters. I used their easy-to-use, bulletproof G3 hub-based power meter at the recent Dirty Kansas 200-mile gravel race. Learn more about the training involved in my race and my transition from cyclocross racer to endurance guy in an upcoming episode of Fast Talk. Learn why gathering accurate power data from my PowerTap, which is able to deliver plus or minus 1.5% accuracy, played a critical role in that transition. Thanks to Ceres and PowerTap for their support of Fast Talk. Tell us a little bit about yourself, Colby Pearce. I know that you have a lot of racing experience. Even Leonard Zinn told me you used to go to his house when you were 13 years old and geek out on stuff with Vaughters. Here, Leonard, here's some tubing. Make me a new fork with a little less rake and a this and a that.
Fact,
yeah. Tell us a little bit more about yourself.
I mean, yeah, you could put all that in a pile and just say hopeless bike dork. Let's see. Okay, I'll try to keep this really cliff notes. Started racing in like 89. Went out, started mowing lawns, saved up immediately for a track bike, a mountain bike, a cross bike after I got my road bike. I mean, like any good cyclist should.
Yes,
started driving to the Springs when I could and just fell in love with the sport. It was like I got hit by a lightning bolt. I literally went home after my first criterium ever and was like, well, I'm a bike racer now, and I shaved my legs, much to my stepmom's dismay. She was like, what are you doing? So raced. Wasn't anything amazing in terms of raw talent, but just ridiculously stubborn. And so I eventually started to kind of do well. Kind of became a time trialist, raced for Shackley in the late 90s, stint on Carter Cyclist, Prime Alliance, O-Photo, American Pro Scene, started to get better at track, did some track World Cups, ended up finally going to, I think it was 10 World Championships for USA Cycling.
Wow.
Worked for USA Cycling for a year and a half in 2005, starting in 2005 as track endurance coach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't even mention your hour records that you've had and held and currently hold.
Yeah, I did a hour record in 1995. I broke John Fry's record in Colorado Springs and rode 50.191 k an hour. That was full dork mode, like Lotus. Actually, the bike, even by today's standards, is pretty fast. So I kind of had a little bit of a leg up in the time trialing curve for a couple of years because I was just way more aero than most other people. And then everybody caught up to me, and the guys with real engines started beating me. But then I moved on to track. And then I went to the Olympics in 2004 in Athens, raced the points race. That was an incredible experience. Just amazing. Got to stay through the opening ceremony to the closing ceremony. And then what happened? Oh, then I worked for USA Cycling. Then I came back to racing some more, did a bunch of Pro 6 days, most of which were with Daniel Holloway. Mm-hmm. We raced for 4 seasons of 6 days. That was an incredible experience because it was kind of a return to the old school in a way. Like, I think 6 days are changing now and they've kind of progressed. They're not what they used to be. More track stuff, went to Track Worlds. My last year Track Worlds was 2010. And then I got a job on Garmin for a year with their sports science team. Mm-hmm. That was amazing. Really hard year. Like, took me to my knees a couple times. Did the entire tour, the entire Vuelta, half the Giro, plus some training camps and Worlds. Wouldn't trade it for anything. Learned an amazing amount. Really grateful for the opportunity to work at that level. But I wouldn't do it again either. It was a hard year, man. I kicked my ass. And then I worked for SRM for a year and a half. So we're seeing a pattern here. It's called unemployable.
Year and a half and you're out.
Yep. See ya. Except for my own coaching job, of course, which I've been doing since 2005. But when you're your own boss, things are a lot easier. Also in 2011, 12, I don't know, I'm getting old, man. I went and lived in Sydney for a month with Steve Hogg and trained with him as a bike fitter. That was amazing. I mean, first of all, just to live in a city is cool because you get to not race through it, but you get to like go to the market and buy kangaroo and stuff like that. Super cool. But Steve
kangaroos.
Well, apparently there's like a population problem down there. Yeah. And they're really high in iron, a great source of protein. So, but Steve's an amazing teacher, incredible thinker, out of the sphere type of person.
I think you've got a little bit of that in you.
Think so? I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
You're gonna express some of that today.
I try to think out of the sphere whenever I can. So anyway, then started bike fitting and now I'm bike fitting. I'm coaching. I'm designing some track bikes. I teach at the Velodrome. I teach classes. I teach road and road clinics locally and coaching about 18 athletes. So yeah, bikes. Racing.
You've raced probably more races than just a lot of racing. And so that brings us to today's topic, which is peaking.
Yeah. Well, actually, now that we've heard Colby's experience, that was our hour. So thanks for listening to the podcast.
That was a terrible Cliff Notes version. I talked way too much about myself.
That's all right.
That was, I'd love to hear the full version sometime. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah. Peaking, there's a science side of it. There's a practical side of it, the art and science of peaking. And that's what we want to get into today. Before we get into that, though, I want to have you speak a little bit toward this fear that people might have towards peaking, this, oh my God, rest, take time off the bike. What's that all about?
Well, I think it's easy for cyclists to forget that they actually get stronger when they rest. I mean, you smash your body, you do muscular damage, you deplete your hormones, you dehydrate yourself, you destroy your glycogen reserves, all those other things you do to yourself during training. It takes time for your body to register that load and then have time to repair all the damage you've done. And that's when you get stronger. So that's part of what that taper process is for. It's also what your Monday rest day is for every week, or maybe hopefully more than just one day a week.
So this is a theme that we've brought up multiple times on the podcast, and I jump on any opportunity to bring it up. Remember, the fundamental principle of training is you do damage with training, and then it's in recovery that your body repairs, and if you did the right amount of damage, it super compensates and builds you back stronger. Yeah. And everybody forgets that recovery side of that principle.
It's stubborn. Cyclists are stubborn, and
obsessive.
Obsessive, which is what makes them good athletes in a way, because you
absolutely
have to be that type of person to go out and drill yourself for 30 minutes up a climb and in training a bunch. Otherwise, that's how you get the load you need, but you have to give your body time to respond to that load. And so many cyclists and triathletes as well are just type A personalities. It's go, do. And they're focused on the going and the doing, not the downtime. So, and then of course, as soon as you don't have training as a distraction, then you start thinking about your race and you start thinking about your performance and how invested you are into that, all the training, months of training and preparation you've done, planning, and the money you've spent, and all the sacrifices you made with your family and your friends and and you start getting nervous about how that's going to play out. And that time during the peak, the taper time before the peak really happens is when that sort of mental energy really crescendos, and that can be difficult for an athlete to deal with.
I think the part of that which is makes people nervous is the fact that they don't know enough about it, and that's what we're going to talk about today. They think it's all art, but there is some science to it. There's a lot of practical experience that we can all share with people to help them not be nervous about that, to help them do it correctly, and then peak.
And that's going to be one of the themes of this podcast, and it's quite fascinating, is there is a science side to this, and then there's a practical experience side to it. And we're going to start by saying, here's what the science says. But I think as we go through the podcast, that's actually going to get quite gray.
Why don't we start with the science, Trevor?
Absolutely. What a segue. Let's go right into, here is what the science says a peak should be. So I'm going to give you the classic, if you read research or read a review on peaking science, here's basically what it's going to tell you to do. I mean, there's different variations, so I'm just going to give you kind of a broad overview. But essentially, a peaking strategy can last anywhere from 4 to 28 days, so basically 4 weeks. And what they suggest in the science, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but you start actually with a big week where you actually quite intentionally overreach. So I always like to say to my athletes when we talk about a taper and bringing down the amount of stress you're putting your body under, you have to be tapering from something. So if you're sitting on a couch and say, okay, now I need to get strong for a race, so I'm going to rest more, you're just getting out of shape. So it's, again, you need to do that damage and then let your body repair from it. So most of the literature, when you see a peaking strategy, they talk about some sort of week-long functional overreach. And that's about 4 weeks out, so 28 days out to about 21 days out. And then the research really does talk about 2-3 weeks of bringing down the training stress. And what they say is you have 3 factors in your training. You have intensity, you have frequency, and you have volume. And it seems that you want to maintain the intensity. So you want to keep up interval work, whatever you're doing. You want to maintain frequency. So still train most days. It's the volume that you want to bring down. And the research says you want to bring that volume down somewhere 40 to 60%. Which is a lot. So you're essentially cutting your training time in half or more. And that's where people kind of flip out saying, well, wait, I need to be training that little. So if you think about that, if you're typically training 12 hours a week, for the 2 weeks before your big event, you're cutting down to 5-6 hours a week. So that's a pretty big cut. That's what the research says. And again, going back to that overreach. So there was one really interesting study. This was in 2014, Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise. The lead author was Dr. Aubrey. And it actually compared doing an overreach followed by a taper to basically doing standard training and then tapering down. They found about half of the people actually, they just had kind of acute fatigue. The other half were truly overreached, meaning they were starting to push towards a bit of burnout. And what they found was the group that was just fatigued, acutely fatigued, saw the biggest bump in their form. Both of the groups that were overreached beforehand still performed better than the control group when they hit the target events. So in this case, they used time trials. But so they basically did the overreach and then they did a time trial every week for 4 weeks. It wasn't until the 4th week that you saw the people that were actually truly overreached able to match the people that were just acutely fatigued.
So it took longer for them to catch up, basically.
So it took them longer to catch up. That's exactly the way to put it. In the study, they tried to explain the difference between the people who were just fatigued and the people who were overreached. And they used some psychological measures like the PALM scale. And found that both groups that went through this overreaching protocol showed the signs of mentally being fatigued. They described themselves as fatigued. Their PALM scores were fatigued. But in the group that was truly overreached, you also saw a decline in performance. So they just couldn't hit the same numbers. Yeah. And the conclusion of the study is if you overreach yourself to that point where you just can't hit the numbers anymore, you're actually not going to get as good a taper.
Yeah.
But certainly they said in both cases, they still performed better in the people who didn't do an overreach beforehand.
So from my perspective, that comes down to really understanding your baseline as an athlete, right? Because I used to joke about one of my Shackley teammates in the past where he would go best after he broke a bone. It's like the guy, this dude was infamous for sort of always being just totally smoked, just always training too much. You know, his famous saying was 100K a day, right? That was his baseline. Like he would ride 100K a day. He also did 1,000 sit-ups a day. I'm sure there's some people on the podcast who can figure out who this is, but I don't need to name names. But the guy was just smoked, but then he would fall down and break his collarbone. And 6 weeks later, he'd just be like an uncaged tiger, right? It was that forced rest. So there's some athletes, if they're really type A and their baseline is like they're barely above water all the time, and then you try to push them, you try to give them some week that's another whatever plus 15 or 20% TSS or load or volume or however you want to quantify it, it might just bury them for so long that they may not come out of the cave in time for their event unless you give them a really long taper. So then you have to really be careful about how much you're going to push them for that last week of extra load. On the other hand, if someone's load is a little more sustainable, a little more balanced with what their regular life is, and then you give them that plus 20%, for example, then that can be the perfect setup. You get that roller coaster, that big load, and then they feel like their legs are tree trunks every time they walk upstairs for 10 days. And then magically, 12 days out, all of a sudden, 2 days before the race, they go, wow, I just danced up that hill. Yeah. And then they go to the race and knock it out of the park. That's the goal, right?
My old mentor, he won the national championships, I think 3 times back in the 80s. And I asked him what some of his training strategies were, and he said, I had the simplest strategy in the world. I was the only person who showed up to the national championships rested.
Yep.
We had, when I was managing Team Rio Grande, we had a guy on that team who had this phenomenal year where he was ranked top 10 in the U.S. And if you talk to him about that year, he says, he got hampered that year because he kept getting sick all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And he said, if I just didn't get sick and train like that, I'd have the best year of my life. And he doesn't because you were getting sick about every 4 weeks, you were forcing yourself to take a rest. And that's actually why that was your best year.
Right. Gives you that natural undulation in your training stress.
Let's talk a little bit about the physiology of what's going on with a peak.
Mm-hmm.
So you had brought up one earlier on about repairing damage.
Yep.
Which is certainly a big part of it. So did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, it depends a little bit on what kind of training you're doing, but if you're in the gym or if you're doing a lot of high torque work on the bike, if you're doing a lot of sprints, standing starts, acceleration, glycolytic work, that's going to cause a lot of muscular damage. Even, of course, if you're doing a lot of VO2, that can cause muscular damage. So, or if you're just doing really hard group rides, that'll loop that in. So muscular damage is one of the aspects that you just got to let your muscles heal from that trauma. It's raw physical trauma. Yeah. And when they bounce back, of course, when you tear down the muscle fibers, you got to give them time to get stronger. They build to get stronger. The fibers get more resilient, and then you can make more force later. Or you can make either higher peak force or more force or a longer duration.
So this is one I actually researched last night because I was very interested. That's what we've always been taught. And what they say in the physiology is that you're allowing that repair, and the repair is going to build you back stronger. We've also talked in the past that when you are training really hard and fatigued, you're producing a lot of your body's natural painkillers, your catecholamines, which unfortunately actually block muscle repair. So you need to rest enough to allow those to clear out so your body can actually repair the damage. But I found a couple really fascinating studies. And sorry, we won't be too study heavy here. We're just getting these out of the way at the beginning of this podcast. But a couple fascinating studies that found what's actually adapting, what's actually getting stronger. So there is some improvement in your body's ability to store glycogen. Certainly there's repair damage. They demonstrated these. But the one that I had never heard about and correlated very closely with improvements in performance with the taper was in type 2A muscle fibers. Mm-hmm. So these are, when you think of your slow twitch muscle fibers, the ones that work purely with oxygen, those are your type 1. Your type 2X are the ones that are really your strong fibers, but work purely anaerobically or almost purely anaerobically, so they don't last very long. These 2As are the in-between ones that can go one way or the other. So they can either build their aerobic machinery and act more like a slow twitch muscle fiber, or they can become big anaerobic animals and produce a lot more power. What they saw during the taper, and this was with endurance athletes, so one study was with runners, one study was with cyclists, was that these 2A fibers, there was a big increase in oxidative enzymes. And an increase to the point that they actually matched the type 1 fibers. So you were seeing them essentially having the same aerobic activity, oxidative activity as your slow twitch muscle fibers. Even though the slow twitch muscle fibers also saw an improvement in those enzymes during the taper. But this was the part that really caught my attention. There was an increase in the cross-sectional area of these 2A fibers. So they increased in size and became more powerful. But what was fascinating about it was they saw about a 15% improvement in the diameter of these fibers, which translated about 5% per week. When you go into the weight room and do a strength training program, typically improvements in the diameter of muscle fibers is a little under 3%. So somehow tapering from an endurance event was increasing the size of these muscle fibers more than just going into the weight room and doing strength training, which even the researchers were sitting there kind of scratching their head going, this needs research because that's what you're trying to do in the weight room, and we're producing it just with a taper.
Now, is that a study you'll put in the show notes for?
Oh, yeah. No, I always put all the
Great.
All the references up and happy to send it. So there's 2 studies here that both show this dramatic increase in the cross-sectional area. So essentially what's happening is all the muscle fibers are seeing some repair and improvement during the taper, but it's particularly these 2As, which become very oxidative, but at the same time increase in their diameter and also become much stronger. And that's where we seem to see a lot of this taper come from, or the improvements during the taper come from.
So it's like every cyclist dream, you get to lay on the couch and literally grow muscle.
Exactly. Yes. And to a level that most your bodybuilders in the weight room would look at this and go, damn, I need to go do some endurance training and sit on the couch.
Yeah. Interesting.
And the last important thing in this study was that they had people who tapered by reducing volume but keeping the intensity up, and they had people who tapered by reducing intensity but keeping the volume up. And you only saw these changes in the people who reduced volume but maintained intensity.
Yeah, I remember studying Mujica years ago, and I've got his book, and he's one of the kind of premier guys who studied tapering and peaking quite a bit. He's written a lot of literature. He's been a lot of studies on it, and that was always his nuts and bolts, was reduce volume, maintain or even increase intensity, and maintain exercise frequency. It took me a long time to get my head wrapped around that intuitively as an athlete and then later as a coach, because for me, when I would finish a really big block of overreaching, I would kind of just want to cut it off and just not do too much. Right. That was my instinct. I mean, but I was the guy who really buried myself in the overreaching part. But you got to maintain that intensity, keep things firing, keep things open, keep all the pathways sort of active and mobilized or energized, or however you want to describe it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I learned the value of that overreach week a long time ago. But my strategy always for that week after, when you start tapering down, it's like you said, you start looking at intervals and going, oh, no more intervals.
Right.
So my technique is I go to a training race, and when I get there, I'm like, my goal today is not to finish. I'm going to attack so much and so hard, I'm going to blow myself up. And so you really get that high intensity.
Yeah.
I just kind of do it in a fun way, but you have to keep that intensity.
Yeah. My method for that in the last few years actually has been pick a short Strava locally. I'll do this for my athletes. I'm like, today's the day you're going to go. There's a Juilliard climb here in Boulder locally. We don't have that many good local little circuits with short hills. Most of the time, if you want a short climb where you can do some high power, you kind of have to go up a canyon and then do a U-turn in the middle or something.
Right.
Just recover on the climb and keep going. But Juilliard's it's a short climb. It's probably
less than a minute.
Less than a minute. Well, depending on what direction you hit it from and how far you go. But yes, if you come down from the steep descent into it, it's less than a minute, and it's probably, 10%? Maybe
I'd probably say 12.
12, kind of towards the top a little bit, and then it kind of tapers out, and man, you can just light yourself up like a Christmas tree on that thing. And so I'll go and just see what I can do on Strava on that thing, and I don't really care that much, but it gives you some accountability. It's a little bit fun. I can do it on my terms. I go put on my race wheels and my skin suit if I want to. Stash my balls in the bushes. Give away all my secrets.
Do you have the KOM, Colby?
No, not even close. But especially not on a climb like that. That's like the anti-Colby.
Yeah,
but
true.
One of my athletes, Nathan Haas, does have it, and I had him do it last year just to.
All right.
It's like living through my children in a sense.
For all you listeners out there, go and try.
Try it.
Try Juilliard in Boulder.
Yeah. Full disclaimer, you do need someone to flag the intersection because it's
That's
a three-way.
true.
You got to make sure there's not a car coming, but
Damn
so you got to have
Strava.
a buddy. Yeah, to make sure that when you bomb that descent. Anyway.
Yep,
and here's the good old, every rule should be broken, because I think we've said at one point or another that Strava is not good training. But here's a case where Strava is actually really good training.
It keeps it fun. I like to use it at the right moment in my athletes' programs. I like to use it for myself.
Sparingly, but
at
key
I do.
moments.
I do. Yeah. And threshold for me, and this, I don't want to digress too far, but threshold for me is like frosting on a cake. You need just enough. You smear that thing with frosting, it's just going to ruin the whole cake. But the little at the right moment brings everything together. It's also like salt in a soup, better analogy. Too much salt in the soup, the thing's it's inedible. The entire recipe's ruined. But you put just enough in there, a healthy dose at the right moment, and boom, it brings everything to life. It's a flavor enhancer. That's what threshold is for a training program. So I'll sprinkle some threshold into my athletes' programs here and there. And the best way to do that is say, hey, go try Superflag.
Yep.
Go and throw it on Strava, because then it gives them a little bit of accountability. It gives them that little bit of like, somehow I know someone's watching.
Someone's watching. Yep.
Yeah. And then it can drive it in. But I'm not a fan of it every week. I don't think it's constructive, or every third day.
Or when Sepp Goose starts a minute before you. As I discovered.
Yes. Sepp.
Yeah, Sepp.
But otherwise, it's great. There is some question about what exactly a peak is physiologically. I like to refer to a peak as the first symptom of burnout, because from my experience, that tends to be what follows, especially if you carry a peak too long. But others see it as the body simply getting into balance. Robert Pickles, the head physiologist at Pearl Izumi and someone who has 20 years of experience helping athletes perform their best, shared with us his thoughts on peaking and why it's about getting the body back in balance.
Peaking is certainly, in my opinion, a necessity for performance, right? Where we're bringing the body essentially back in balance from the stress of training. That's ultimately trying to break us down into the rebound that's going to help our physiological adaptation. And peaking is really just a name that we've given, right? We're people. We like to put things in nice, neat little boxes. Peaking is a name that's given to a strategy to try to bring the body into a good place. For me, in my opinion, the best peaking is typically when we maintain intensity and we reduce volume. And physiologically, there's a lot of different things going on. For me, a big part of that is just even something as simple as glycogen repletion, right? We're going through big, heavy weeks of training. Even though we're eating a lot, we're always operating at a moderate amount of glycogen impairment. And through peaking with the reduced volume, we're filling those fuel stores. And we're providing the body with that energy that it's going to need for that high output competition. Beyond that, we can talk a lot about reduction of muscle damage. We can talk about decreases in inflammation. We can talk about all of these different things that go into how we're feeling. But, one of the easiest things for people to understand is it brings our carbohydrate stores back into balance.
Physiologically, is there a danger to trying to extend a peak? So an athlete has that feeling of, wow, I'm on fire, I'm hitting PRs, I'm just racing better, and I've been racing all season. Everybody wants to hold on to that. Is there a danger in trying to hang on to that as long as you can?
At some point in time, you're losing fitness, right? And we're talking a balance of that chronic training load over time versus acutely what's occurring, right? And if that chronic training load is relatively low, then we do not have the stimulus that causes the body to improve. We're responding to that day-to-day change in intensity and volume. And so, you can't peak. 2 weeks is oftentimes cited as what you can maintain a true peak for. And if you try to go below or longer than that, then your fitness is going to come down. Now, that doesn't mean you might still perform well. There's no question about that. But for you as an individual, you're no longer optimal and you're coming down the backside of the curve at that point in time.
Okay, so we've talked all about this science of peaking. When they look at what the top athletes are doing, do we find out that they're actually conforming to what the science says they should do, or are they doing something else?
So we said at the beginning that we're going to take the science, which is pretty crystal clear, and we're going to make it gray. And this is the start of making it gray. And then when we start giving our advice, it's probably going to get grayer. So interestingly, it doesn't seem like it was until recently that some people said, why don't we see what the best are actually doing when they peak for races? So I found two studies. One took they're both with cross-country skiers. One took 11 athletes who were all gold medalists at either the Olympics or the World Championships.
So they were all Norwegian, basically.
Pretty much. Yeah. It was definitely a Norwegian study. This was in 2014. It was actually led by Seiler.
Oh, was it?
Another study, and unfortunately, I don't know cross-country skiing, so I don't know her name, but I believe it was a Norwegian athlete, and they talked about her being the best cross-country skier of all time. And I think she's won 18 medals between World Championships and Olympics.
That's more than Colby.
By a good margin.
Her tapering strategy was very similar to this other study, these other medalists. So I'll basically just kind of lump it all together. One thing that did fit with the research is while they were in their taper during the couple weeks before the event, they kept up their high intensity work. They definitely did a bigger week about 3 weeks out from the event. But this is where it starts to fall apart. So here's right out of the study. Training volume, frequency, and intensity remained unchanged from pre-peaking to peaking period.
All three variables stay the same.
All three variables stay the same. So, okay. I mean, you actually look at the graph here during the final week of the event, or actually it was 2 weeks before, it came down just a little bit, but it was not significant. It was certainly lower than during their preparation phase, much earlier on in the season. But you look at those few weeks leading up to the event, from pre-peak to the actual peak, there actually wasn't that big a change. The other thing that was really interesting is they looked at the records of how many people took a rest day 12 days out, how many took a rest day 11 days out, and so forth and so on. And what you see is 2 weeks before the event, so from 12 days out to 6 days out, there was always at least one athlete taking a rest day, and often 3-4 athletes that would take a rest day on one of those days. But 5 days out, 4 days out, 3 days out, and 1 day out, not a single athlete took a rest day.
Yeah, they're all training.
They're all training.
And by rest day, you mean complete rest, no active recovery. Just,
right.
Yeah.
And the other thing is if you look at their the 14 days out, we have this little graph here that shows how many athletes did high-intensity intervals on 14 days out, 13 days out, all the way out to 1 day out. And you can see on average 4 athletes were doing high intensity on every one of those days. There wasn't a single day where there wasn't at least 1 or 2 athletes doing high intensity intervals. And the day where you saw the most number of athletes, so 8 of them doing high intensity intervals,
2 days
was
out.
2 days out.
2 days out, yeah. Prime the system, prime the engine.
Openers, as you might call them.
Yeah. In the cycling world. That's interesting. One thing that I'll share with respect to how I coach my athletes, especially when they're getting ready for an event that requires, cycling's such a momentum sport, meaning really you do need openers. Like in all the time, I've been racing 30 years, and in many times you get mixed results, meaning if you have a forced rest of some type, let's say you crash hard or you're sick or whatever, and then for whatever reason you have to jump into a race. Sometimes you'll show up to that race and magically your legs will be open. Everything will fire and you'll just feel floaty and light. You'll surprise yourself. But more often than not, I would say you end up with heavy legs, dead legs. You do one effort and kind of blow up, and then you're sort of gassed for the rest of the race until it's probably a result of your blood volume being low and a few other physiological factors that just prevent you from running the engine red hot and open. So we've all learned the hard way that we need those openers, right? To a certain extent, in between those opening sessions, those periods of intensity, those intervals running into in the last week, I'll recommend that people just hop on the rollers is my favorite way to do it. And I actually call this workout stir the soup. And it's just a light, really it's the other term I'll use is minimum effective dose. So I'll say 30 to 45 minutes, just sort of get going, get your kids nice and light, start off and around zone 1 heart rate, progress to zone 2. As soon as you break a good sweat and you get over that point where your legs are burning and then the burn starts to kind of subside, meaning you've sort of processed whatever you're going to process, you've stirred up circulation, you've raised your muscle temperature, you're done. And that's usually between 25 and 45 minutes of riding. Stir the soup. And
you like soup, don't you? That's your second soup reference.
I like soup.
Yeah.
Soup is good.
Yeah, it is.
Soup is good.
All right.
Yeah.
I think what we're getting from these Olympic athletes who, because, if they're getting gold medals, they've figured some things out. And you just looked at the graph. There was a fair amount of consistency between these athletes. So it wasn't like it was one outlier. And I think the summary of these athletes is, yes, you need to keep up the high intensity work. I think that athlete they were saying was the best of all time. She slightly increased her high intensity work. You made it a little harder during her taper. You still saw a trend towards decreasing volume, and these studies were saying you're seeing more like 15, 18%, not the 40 to 60% that they're recommending in the research.
So it's just a lesser taper.
Right.
It's still tapering, but just not as dramatic as what the science is saying.
The other thing that I thought was interesting is that bigger week where they do a little bit of a functional overreach was 3 weeks out, not 4 weeks out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So it was a little closer to event. So the taper was a little shorter. And you can see here that overreach week wasn't huge. Mm-hmm. It was just bigger, a little bigger than normal. So little less drop in volume, keep up the high intensity, do that overreach a little bit beforehand. And both studies, one of their conclusions was these are athletes who are racing all the time.
Yes.
They don't have the luxury to do a big 3-week taper. So that might be one of the factors is they've actually trained how to recover really quick and get ready for the next race, recover quick, get ready for the next race, and might just be able to handle it a little bit better.
Yeah, it's interesting too to consider kind of the demands of the events the athletes are competing in and what they're trained to, what their baseline is. That's what we're talking about is change in homeostasis, right? We want a desired effect, and we have a given load, and we have to look at what that workload is, try to quantify it, try to measure it so we can figure out what it is, and then change it, manipulate it accordingly so that we get a result for our peak event.
Anybody who's gone through a physiology program, there is an expression, which is all training causes a conversion from fast twitch fiber to slow twitch fiber. Mm-hmm. And people will say, well, that's crazy. What about going in the weight room? Well, look at your bodybuilders. They have all these veins because they're actually developing a lot of slow twitch muscle fiber. The best way to redevelop fast twitch muscle fiber is sitting on the couch. Mm-hmm. And again, you look at what is the most powerful anaerobic animal in the world. You think of something like the cheetah.
Yep.
What does it spend most of its time doing?
Sleeping in a tree.
Right. Just sitting around.
Yeah.
And I see athletes all the time. They get injured or they get sick and they have to take 2 weeks off the bike. Then they get back on. They do a sprint and go, that's the best power I've ever seen.
Of course.
So tapering for track events, you really need to drop that volume.
And we're not just talking about kilos or team sprints. We're talking about points race Madison, the endurance track events, which are still long duration by track standards, but short by road standards. We're talking about a 25-minute race, but very intense, right? 9 or 10 sprints. I've worked with a lot of track athletes, in particular those on the sprinting side. That requires, I think, more of an extreme reduction in volume because it's so important to be fresh. It's really important to be open, but it's almost more important to be fresh because the efforts are so explosive and you have to go so deep. And the events are separated by sometimes thousandths of a second. So you really need that ability to just absolutely open the engine 100% all the way. And road cyclists don't really live in that world necessarily. And I would argue that two other events that fall into those categories that when we look at the broad spectrum are, one is shorter mountain bike races, in particular short tracks or shorter cross countries, even some cyclocross races, because there's a high component of explosive nature to those events. You need to be able to produce a lot of power over short bursts. And the other one is, of course, shorter time trials. Prologue TT is a great example. And you see so many Prologue TT results where there's one athlete who just smokes everybody by a significant margin, right? How many times have we seen that? Like one guy's 12 seconds and then there's a herd of dudes that are right behind him. And you're going, what is the difference there? And I have no science to back this up at all, but I'd be willing to bet that that guy is the guy who probably cut his volume more or her volume more running into that event. And that's what enabled them to gain that significant margin. They were just able to access those anaerobic reserves so much more effectively on the day.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. And I think you look at the opposite. All of us have probably had this experience where you've done several weeks of big volume. And I kind of call it, you just become a tank.
Yeah.
You can put out this decent, kind of, depending on the person, high 200-watt power.
Yeah. Diesel mode. Yeah.
All the time. But if somebody attacks, you're just like, no, I'll just diesel them back.
Right.
And you have no jump.
Yeah.
To step back for just a second, I'm curious if you have thoughts on how big that overreach week should be, if there are any guidelines there.
So I think going back to that study, they had a really good differentiation, which is everybody who went through that overreach week described themselves as fatigued. When they did the POM scale, they came up as fatigued. The difference between the people that saw the big jump in form and the people who didn't was a drop in power. The people who saw a really good taper period, even though they were fatigued, if they had them go and do a test, they could still produce the power. So you could almost just take the approach of do interval, if you're building that week, do intervals towards the beginning of that week, towards the end of that week. And if you're 30, 40 watts down, you probably overdid it. Or have some sort of a test. Maybe you just have just a 5-10 minute hill climb, do it at the beginning, and you should still be somewhat in the same neighborhood towards the end of that week.
Maybe. I mean, arguably part of that week is to put you in the valley of fatigue, right? And this jumps ahead a bit to my own experience. Last year, I kind of did a little week-long build for Masters Track Worlds. And I've been around a while, so I figured I'd roll the dice a bit and see what happened. I probably averaged, I don't know, your normal working guy, Masters still bike dork volume of training for most of the summer. Haute Route Rockies aside, I probably averaged 10 or 12 hours a week, nothing too flash. The 3 weeks before Masters Worlds, I decided I was going to do like a 26-hour week. And half of that just sort of worked out to be the way it was. I'd kind of get up every day and go, okay, I'm not totally smashed. Let's see what happens. And I was going to the track and do some intervals. It was also really rainy that week, so some of it was literally dodging rainstorms or not dodging. But man, for like 3 days after that, I was terrible. And I went on, we have a local group ride here that I did, and a local kid who comes in, sometimes we're pretty close on climbs. Usually we are. He just destroyed me that day. I mean, there was no doubt. And I just felt like I was dragging a tree stump. There was no doubt I was still in the valley of fatigue at that point. But 8 days later, I got to Masters and felt like I couldn't feel the pedals. It was no chain every day.
So now the one thing that's interesting there is you said 2-3 days later.
Yes. I was still fatigued. That was 2 or 3 days after that. It was the first ride. It was the first day where I tried to go hard after my significant overreach. Yeah.
So, but that's also after the painkillers have cleared out and your body's gone into a recovery mode. So that study that I was just quoting, I actually read last summer. And with the athletes I coach, I'm big on doing training camps a couple times through the winter. So fatigue weeks. And I always tell them, by the end of this week, I want you good and toast. Like you need some rest. With some of them, we experimented a little bit this year. And on the last day of their camp, I had them do something with some intensity. And I was actually, even though they were saying, I'm tired, I've got 1 day left in me, how many of them were actually able to put out the best wattage I've seen this winter?
Yeah.
But then they rest. 2-3 days later, they contact me and they go, I couldn't get out of bed this morning. Yeah. And then if they got on the bike, they probably couldn't break 200 watts.
Yep.
And you're saying that's because all of the natural painkillers have cleared their system?
You have to clear those painkillers for their body to do the repair.
Yeah.
And that's suddenly when you feel how damaged you are.
How much work you've done. Yeah.
I think it's clear that with the different philosophies and things that we're discussing, that we're starting to get into that gray area where it's a little bit more art. And I think that that's interesting. I think that everybody has a method. I think we're trying to help people hone that method, but I think it's also things you have to try. You have to experiment. Even Trevor, who's been doing this a long time, even Colby, who's been doing it for 30 years, is still experimenting, still tweaking, fine-tuning, searching for what works for them. And as you age, it might change. As you race more, it might change.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. There's an individual side of it. You and I are both that time trial style rider, and I know I can dig myself into a dark, deep place of fatigue and actually a week and a half later come out of it and have that big kind of bump, that taper bump. I've certainly seen with some of the athletes I've coached that if I ever dug them that deep, it's the end of their season.
Yep.
So there's
a fine line there. And it's all about knowing the athlete and looking at their lifetime athletic ability, because I know myself well enough after being in the sport for 3 decades that I can pull that off. But in 1998, I dug myself in a huge hole, for example, and it was one of those years where in May I kept going. I'm going to hit a new plateau. I'm going to be the fastest Colby ever, and I just ground myself into dust.
Yep.
And I was never the same athlete for the last 3 months of the season. I was just barely above water, just hanging on for dear life. I could fake a flat criterium, and that was about it. No explosive power, no snap. As soon as I tried to do anything deep at all, it was just hopeless. So that's part of what training's about, is learning your own limits. Learning the limits of your athletes. Hopefully you don't push them as far as I did myself that time. You figure it out beforehand. But
what's some of your best?
Well, I'd have to say the hour record in 95 was a good one. Fodders helped me with that. We were kind of training buddies, sparring buddies back then, and he was working with Audrey van Diemen, who's a Dutch coach who exercise physiologist, pretty smart guy. And I mean, JV and I were some of the first guys in the US to have SRMs. This is like Greg LeMond, and then like
you two,
who are Colby Pearce and Jonathan Votters. So that year we learned a ton, and Adri started coaching JV, and he actually knew how to use the power to coach, which no one did back then. So that was pretty cool. But
do you remember the specifics of it?
Yeah, roughly. Yes. And some of the power data is gone. Unfortunately, it's like over the years of transferring to hard drives and stuff, I've lost some of it, sadly. But I recall doing a 35-kilometer trial run on the Tuesday before. I believe I did the hour on, it was the 31st. I think it was a Sunday, if I remember correctly. And that was kind of my last big ride. And the whole idea was to simply be on pace. And remarkably, this is Colorado Springs in 1995 as an outdoor velodrome. So luckily, the weather just happened to be nice that day. It was one of those perfect Septembers where we had lots of good days of weather. And I did it. And I remember finishing that 35K trial, being exactly on Fry's pace and distinctly thinking like I could easily go faster. So that was a huge boost for me. So when you're in that position, it's easy to have a positive mental outlook because you go, all I have to do is not trip down the stairs or catch the flu in the next, 4 days and I'm good to go.
Yep.
That's the perspective I had going on. And then still to this day, actually, I did my opener as just a classic straight up 5-minute VO2, just like eyeballs bleeding as fast as you can go the day before, open everything out until you're absolutely annihilated, like pursuit pace. And that, you do a little bit of prep before and a little bit of warm down after, but basically that's the nuts and bolts of the tune up. And that's kind of what I remember from my last week. I don't recall real clearly what I did. I think actually during my overreach period, if I remember correctly, it was the Colorado Cyclist stage race was happening in the Springs. I was supposed to do it, but I caught a little bit of a cold, so I decided to skip it. So I got to watch it. Yeah. So this is the year Worlds was in 95. They were in Colombia, I think in Bogota. Mm-hmm. And freaking Miguel Indurain shows up to Colorado Springs with like 3 or 4 Spanish teammates. They do the Colorado Cyclist stage race. These guys had never ridden with helmets before. I mean, this is 1995. They get to the States and like, you have to buy a helmet. You need a helmet. They're like, what's a helmet? They're like, this hard thing you have to put on your head. I mean, so these guys literally walk into like the local bike shop, probably Colorado Cyclist, and buy helmets. I swear, this is not made up or even gratuitous. Like one of the guys raced the entire race with the helmet on backwards. All weekend. Just smashing people off the front, just dropping watt bombs everywhere, climbing like an eagle. And everyone's like, what planet are we on? It's just hilarious. I think they did a Garden of the Gods road race and maybe an Air Force road race or something and something else. And then they went down to Colombia and I don't recall who won Road World that year. 95. Anyway.
All right. We've talked about a lot of the timing of a peak, but how long does a peak actually last in your experience and what does the science say?
Well, I do think the length of a peak can be somewhat personal, but the one thing that is consistent is it's very short. So you do have to time it somewhat for the right event. And you will hear people talk about they hit their peak for the race that was the prep race for the race they cared about a week beforehand. My general experience, and Colby, I'm really interested in hearing yours, but I'll give my quick 2 cents, is you can extend a peak 1, maybe 2 weeks, and you can't really go past that. The big danger with trying to extend a peak is your body's operating at a level above what it's used to. So if you keep trying to push it, it's going to go from peaking to burnout. Or if you continue to really try to taper, eventually that taper is going to turn into detraining. And one way or the other, you're going to lose form. But I have seen a lot of people who are on a peak, they keep trying to push it, and next thing you know, they're burnt out. Mm-hmm. So I'm generally a big believer in target it for the event, get your event done. And then even if you still feel a bit of that peak in your legs, pull the plug before you start burning out. Get that rest and then get back to training so you can get to your next peak, or at least get to good fitness again.
Yeah, get a baseline of fitness going, of regular training load again. Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I've run into that a few times where I've had athletes who, for example, had kind of an early national championship, maybe in June or something like that, and then they have racing immediately afterwards. And maybe in particular that national championship isn't necessarily the most physically taxing, i.e., it's different if you're talking about endurance mountain bike nationals where you're literally going to be feeling your legs for days afterwards, or a stage race versus, for example, masters track nationals where you're there and you're racing and the racing is hard, but you're talking about a 3-kilometer individual pursuit or a 3K team pursuit or, a 20-minute points race. I mean, yeah, the race is hard, but the next day it's not like you're going to be super destroyed and sore. So it's tempting for those athletes to just want to come home and then immediately jump back into the local criteriums and such. And I think you have to respect the fact that from a psychological standpoint, even if the physical load isn't that high, the athlete is so invested in their peak performance, whether it went good or bad, they just need a break. You just need to unplug and not go pin on a number and try again. So sometimes you have to have that discussion with a type A athlete who's like, I want to do more. I feel great. I'm going to keep smashing. let's take a step back and remember what you did. Remember that extra week of load you did, and then that taper, and then remember how we thought you were getting a cold and you were freaking out and I had to call you, and then you went to your race and you did this, and you've been through a lot. Now you flew home. Let's just relax for a bit, and let's just start with some. You don't need to do this criterium, but I really want to do it. I think I can win. We still have 14 weeks of season left or whatever, you know?
Lots of races coming up you can win too.
Yes, the season is long. It's always about the long game, right? Especially at that point. So, but as far as how long a peak actually lasts, yeah, I think if you're talking about a championship event or an event that is really physically exhausting, then even if the person thinks they can keep going, chances are they can't. So you just have to be a little bit firm with them about, as a coach, and plan in advance. Say, look, we are planning a break here. You need a break, because I'm afraid if you keep going, the other danger is you give someone a giant loading week and then you taper them and then they're super fresh and they go to a race and they smash and then they keep going. Well, if the fitness is still there, they're generating a lot more force. And sometimes, in particular, if mechanically something's not quite ideal, then bing, injury.
Yeah. So
right?
that's what I was getting at. Your body's operating at a higher level. I
exactly.
kind of think of it as, this is when you're hitting the NOS button in the car. And you talk to any drag racer, if you keep hitting that NOS button,
the engine's going to fall out or something, right? Or some
explosion.
I don't know much about race car engines, but
yeah, actually, I'm kind of guessing myself. But I'm assuming if you keep hitting that
the
NOS
brake light
button,
fluid will fail.
Any listener out there that knows about cars, tell us what. Send us a letter.
Analogy.
Send us a letter.
Yeah.
So of course we're going to get an email saying, no, you keep hitting that NOS button, it cleans everything
goes forever.
out.
Yeah. Exactly. That's not the way human engines work. So, yeah. The trickier part is too, when you have a race that's not a championship event that has a very definitive finality to it. So let's say you're peaking for Tour de Gila, which is in May usually, and then you've got a few weeks of racing after that, and the rider wants to keep going. Then again, man, there's so much racing left. I think it's up to the coach to have that honest conversation with the athlete and say, look, I want you to be good for your September goal, whatever that is.
Or if they don't have a coach, they should have that conversation with themselves. And take the
and be
long
realistic.
View.
Be realistic.
View, like you said.
It's not a weak guy, like I'm not tough enough thing. Everybody has a natural wax and wane to their preparation, their training, how their body responds to load. You can't just go forever.
Right. One of the things I do with all my athletes is whenever they have a target event, about pretty close to that event, I have a talk with them about what's your next event. Because I think it's important to have that in the mind, because when you are building towards a race and you're doing that big overload week and then you're taper and you're trying to be perfect with everything, then you go to this event and you have the event, whether you win or lose, there's always the same reaction a day or two later of, this has been my life. Now what?
Now what?
And there's a bit of depression. And I've felt that depression a bunch of times. And it's really important to be able to look down the road and say, 6-8 weeks from now, I've got that event. So it's not like this is just everything's ended. What do I do with my life?
Yeah.
You don't have to have a big existential crisis.
Today's episode of Fast Talk is sponsored by Ceres, makers of PowerTap power meters. I used their bulletproof G3 hub-based power meter at the recent Dirty Kansas 200-mile gravel race. Learn more about the training involved in my race, my transition from cyclocross racer to endurance guy, in an upcoming episode of Fast Talk. Learn why gathering accurate power data from my PowerTap, which is able to deliver plus or minus 1.5% accuracy, played a critical role in that transition. Thanks to Ceres and PowerTap for their support of Fast Talk. And now, let's get back to the show. So now that we've talked about the science and learned what the best are doing, learned what the literature has said, let's talk a little bit more about the gray areas of this, the art of peaking. Colby, you've had decades of experience here. Tell us a little bit. Give us an overview and perspective on peaking.
Well, for me, I mean, my number one rule as a coach is to always try to see the athlete as an individual. I mean, you have to understand, the more you understand about the athlete, and I don't mean their training stress score. I mean, really understand the athlete, the more you can effectively write training for them. You got to understand what their relationship status is, what they do for a living. Do they spend time on their feet? How good is their diet? How much
stress, the other stresses in their life?
Yeah, because that all, of course, contributes to what they're going to be able to do on the bike. As Paul Chek said, he's a mentor that I've been studying, and an exercise coach and a holistic lifestyle coach. He says, You bring your whole life into the gym. And what he means by that is you bring all your stress into the gym, all your financial stress, all your job worries, all your relationship concerns, your whatever it is. If you have an injured heart from a bad relationship experience, that's going to impact you as you make effective work on the bike, because as we all know, everyone's personality comes out on the bike. I mean, that's one of the things I love about cycling. You put someone 20 minutes into a really hard climb and they're scrapping to make the lead group. You look at the expression on their face. There's something primal about that. And that's the summation of who they are as a person. And that's not just all the intervals they've done. That's their whole life experience. So
I'm a mean guy in the Peloton. I'm not sure I like where you're going with this.
The scowl, the Trevor Connor scowl.
And Chris Horner's always smiling. I don't know what that says, but so my point is you have to understand the athlete on a holistic level. And of course, part of that on the more granular sense is that you have to understand, really be in touch with what their training load has been. So when you think backwards, just like you think backwards from the finish line when you're sprinting in a criterium to this corner, that corner, whatever, where am I going to set up my sprint? It's the same concept in a taper, and then a loading week, and then a taper into peak performance. And you have to say, how far out am I going to put this peak? How am I going to instruct my rider to do this? Right. And that gets into my practical tips on how to do that, which are very important, I think, in my experience.
But it also sounds like you're saying that each individual athlete has to put the time and the experimentation in to find what's the best peak for them.
I would agree with that. It's difficult to do because it's one of those experiments that you can only do so often. I mean, you could tell someone that for a local road race, they're going to do a full, 1 week load that's going to be plus 40% of their normal training volume, and then have them taper for 8 days and then try it at a road race. It might be successful for some athletes, and it's probably a good idea, but in practicality, it may not work out that effectively because that's a lot. And in particular, when you're talking about 95% of all athletes, they don't have the flexibility to manipulate their schedule that regularly. I mean, every once in a while you have the dream client who runs their own company or whatever. Maybe they have very flexible employment or that kind of thing. And that's great. Then you can play with those variables a little more, but most athletes I coach don't have that. So when
a little more constricted in there.
Exactly. Yeah. If their regular weekly load is 10 hours, you say, look, I want you to do 16 hours, 16-hour work rate for 8 or 9 days, and then cut it off 9 days before a local criterium. They're going to be like, well, how many times a year do I have to do this? Well, we're going to do it twice more to practice and then once at nationals. And they go, no chance. Like, I can't take that much time off work. So yes, ideally you would practice it, but unfortunately most of those there's so much that goes into it. Most of the time it ends up being for an actual event, in my experience. And the other thing I'll say to that is we all tend to think of our sort of optimal performances in the past. And it's kind of the same thing in terms of if 3 years ago an athlete did X, Y, Z PDQ before a certain race, they're going to want to take that same 8-day pattern and the same intervals at the same hill and the same recovery shakes they were drinking and say, well, if I just replicate that now, I'll have the exact same result. But of course, 3 years of life have happened. You're not the same athlete. You haven't trained the same. You got married and had a kid, or you changed your job 3 times or whatever. All these other things have happened. You've had different training load, different race schedule, different teammates, So we can't it's not that formulaic. So my point is, even if we have a baseline sort of idea around something that worked in the past, it doesn't mean it's going to work for you in the future. Of course, you can take that structure and manipulate it or change it, use it as a baseline, but you can't replicate it. I've had so many athletes that, particularly you hear this with riders who get lost for a season, they kind of feel like they trained hard, but it didn't work. And then a lot of times they'll go to a nuts and bolts approach. They'll go, well, 2 years ago, I was dropping everybody and I dropped this guy and that guy and I won these races. So I'm just going to start doing what I did then. Unfortunately, that line of thought, I have yet to see it actually pan out. So because you've got the previous 12 months of different stuff in your body. So what are we talking about? We have to boil it down to nuts and bolts. We have to look at the bottom line of what the basic concepts are. And I agree that maintaining or increasing intensity is important. It depends a little bit on how much intensity you've had in your program. If you're a person whose idea of intensity is 5 times 6 minutes at VO2 power, and you're actually doing 30 minutes at VO2 power, which most people aren't, secret, when they do 30 minutes of work. Some are, but many aren't. Then you might be well advised to cut it down to 15 minutes on your VO2 day. I'm talking about during your actual taper, right? But for someone who's doing 12 minutes worth of work, high quality work, or maybe more poignantly, if you have a master's athlete who's training 8 to 10 hours a week all summer, Are you really going to ask them to cut their volume again by 40 to 60% to train 5 hours? That's what the science recommends. On the flip side, that's not what the athletes, at least at the Olympic level, are doing. I don't know how pertinent that is to a master's athlete who's training, or anyone who's training. It doesn't have to be a master. Anyone who's training 8 to 10 hours a week. It's like, okay, does that mean on your day where you were going to do a 75-minute lunch ride, you're now doing a 38-minute lunch ride? I mean, come on. Like, just go for the hour. Like, get a proper warm-up in, do your work, do a little bit less volume of intensity. This is my general thought pattern, but make sure that intensity is very sharp, right? And I also tend to look at physiological sort of windows, meaning there are certain durations of intervals that really tax someone's body, and there are other durations that are a little more sustainable. One of those durations is right around a minute, things get really hard. If you do a 1 minute interval with a gun to your head, the last 15 seconds, you are really pedaling through clay, mud, and cement, right? That's because all the glycolytic system for most people shuts down, usually around 45 seconds in. So you're kind of forcing it. Now, that type of stimulus can be very useful at certain points in a program, but when you do it all the time, it can really be very damaging. So maybe during your taper period, you cut that down to 45-second intervals. I love 45-second intervals. I think they're very useful for emptying the glycolytic tank, right? There are times when I give my athletes 1 minute intervals. There are times when I give them 40. So it's all about context. And the same for me goes for 3 versus 4 versus 5 minute intervals. A 5 minute interval is really just a 4 minute interval with a gun to your head for the last minute. You get to minute 4 and you go, I think I can barely hang on for dear life the last minute. And then I get this wonderful duration, right? So in your taper period, maybe you don't need to quite do all that damage. What your objective is to activate all the energy systems, activate all the enzymes, make sure the body's still awake and open and the muscle fibers are firing and generating force, but not fatigue them.
Right.
To me, it sounds like you're painting a picture that has a lot of nuance, that has a lot of feeling as a coach, responding to the feelings of an athlete. I want to flip over here to Trevor, do you agree with this? Is this how you're coaching?
Shoot it down with some science.
Oh, no, actually. So when I work with an athlete for a taper, same thing. I don't think there's a particular formula. You can just say, here's what you're going to do, and you're going to be perfect on this particular day. It's not that simple. So I actually take much more of an approach of here's how it should feel with the athletes. Mm-hmm. And during that taper week, I talk about we never want to have a time when you are feeling buried and tired.
Agreed.
But when I have them go out and do that intensity work, the way I describe it to them, which is, you're actually being more scientific than I am with your description. But it's kind of the same thing. I say, I want you to go out and I want you to finish that workout saying, that was a good hard workout. I feel like I was hitting some big numbers, but you should not be coming home dragging your feet.
Yes.
You should almost be coming home energized.
That's how I like to it's like if you were doing squats in the gym and you put on a given weight and you're sure you could do 12 reps, we're going to 9 today. You should always come home with a few reps in the tank on your taper week. It's more about perfect execution, perfect form, super high power, crisp, and then you're done and that's it. Put a bow on it, go home, put your feet up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But taper week is off track when an athlete calls me up and says, I'm feeling fatigued, I'm feeling tired.
Yeah.
You never want to get to that point. I mean, you can do that during training, but not on a taper week.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Although I have had athletes in that taper period where things have gone, it's basically they're coming off their big overload week and their normal load is, we'll just say hypothetical numbers, 15 hours a week, and you bump them up to 22 or 23 or 24 hours. So a big increase for their overload week. That would be aggressive. It's going to take them 72 hours where actually they're probably going to feel a little bit worse. And you're going to have to give them some time and you're going to have to coach them through that. That's where the coaching and the pep talks are so important. Say, look, what are we here to do as coaches? We're here to constantly remind our athletes where they are in the big picture because all humans tend to see trees, not forests, especially when the event is coming. And so you have to constantly back them out and give them the 30,000 foot view. Say, look, you should be fatigued right now. You should feel like, do you remember how much work you just did? Do you remember that Tuesday last week, I made you go up Flagstaff 3 times? And you did it. And do you remember that on Friday you set a new 5-minute season best power somehow? You're smashed. So just chill out. Everything's going to work out. We have 9 days until your race.
There's trust involved there.
Yes.
No, that's a really good point. And sorry, when I was saying you should never feel tired, what I meant is you should never put yourself back in a fatigue place with the work that you're doing during the taper week.
Absolutely.
So if you're, if you hit that point where you're feeling pretty rested and then you do a ton of work and you're fatigued again,
You've undone the
it.
point of the taper week. Yeah, agreed.
But I agree with you. You can do that fatigue week, have multiple days in a row where it's kind of scary going, ooh, damn, I'm not even sure I'm going to start this race. And then all of a sudden you wake up one day and go, the best legs I've had all year.
Yep.
The science was saying 3 to 4 weeks for a taper. You were just mentioning a lot of 7-8 days. I'm wondering if you have any more evidence to talk about the timeline of a peak. Have you ever even tried a 4-week taper or a 3-week taper?
Not intentionally. I probably have as a result of sort of extenuating circumstances. For example, there are periods where I myself have been battling like some semi-chronic knee stuff was coming and going early in my career. And I ended up kind of half training, half not. And that effectively ended up being a long taper. What
have you found to be the ideal taper for you, your athletes? What are some of the
For me, I think 7 to 10 days is the sweet spot. 2 weeks out gets to be for someone who's absolutely glued into a 7-day work week schedule. Sometimes you got to finish that build week or that overreaching week 14 days out. So then effectively you are in a 2-week taper. So that's about as much as I had several athletes on that program before Worlds, now that I think about it. So, and that's more a function of the fact that you can just give them 2 big days on the last Saturday and Sunday, and then they got to go to work on Monday. And so what I do in that case is I make sure that that overreaching week or that loading week is significant. And then I tell them you're doing nothing for 2 days, and your third day is a maybe active recovery. So we give them 72 hours to help clear out the system. And then we start a pattern of, for me, what I found really works effectively is a day on, day off pattern. Pretty simple. I've used this for myself. I've used it for track athletes, road athletes. I've used it for juniors going to junior world time trial championships. I've used it for Alex Howes going into US Pro Road Championships, and Worlds, both. Day on, day off. I find it to be very effective. It's simple. It allows the athlete to do just enough work every 48 hours. If you do some type of work that activates things and you kind of approach it like a bit of a cookie sprinkle, it's a little bit of this work, a little bit of that work, a little bit of tempo, a little bit of threshold, some VO2, some short explosive neuromuscular work. And then they get a day of active recovery. And then we repeat that. And then, not exactly the same. The intensity on the on days changes, but fundamentally the pattern is day on, day off. And the day off doesn't have to be active rest, but most of the time it is. And then that's also a day to emphasize recovery modalities.
Yeah, the only thing I have seen or heard in terms of tapering length is when you are tapering for a more of pure endurance event, like you're tapering for a big, long stage race, your taper tends to be shorter. If you're tapering for a shorter, more intense event like track or crits, you need a longer taper.
Well, and if I can interject there for a second, I've noticed working with Garmin with a few athletes, there's some athletes who, depending on, again, the physiology of the rider and the type of rider they are and their context going into the event, sometimes they would really stumble on the second day. And I found this to a certain degree myself as well. If I have a really important stage race, which I don't really do those anymore, but okay, what's the typical stage race pattern for someone who is a person who has good recovery? Is the first day they're fresh, you don't feel the pedals, you're going hard all day, you're swinging this, that, and whatever all over the place, shooting bullets off. Then you wake up the second day and go, oh, what happened? You feel that first day, right? So it's like you're fresh, and then the second day you're in a hole, and then by the third day, then you get the rhythm. Your body's awake and has the rhythm of the race. So several coaches have tried this technique where basically the day before a hard stage race, you actually ride pretty hard. Not in a damaging way. Again, respecting those physiological windows that we talked about, not doing a ton of threshold, maybe more tempo, more glycogen depleting, but then of course you make sure they eat a bunch of carbs that night so they're not going to the line empty, etc. So you actually kind of start the race sort of with a half day, a day before the stage race starts. That's particularly important on a stage race where you might have a day that's a GC day the first day. There's several American races where that can happen. Like Tour de Heel is a great example, right? If you're not open when you're trying to fly up the Mogollon, you lose a bunch of time there, but you go good the rest of the week. Well, there goes your GC, right?
No, I'm a stage racer. I'm a pure stage racer. And my typical day before a stage race I care about is 3+ hours of riding.
Yeah.
I actually do a pretty decent day of riding.
Yeah. The challenge there comes in Pro Tour cycling. You get to the Tour de France and man, it's just chaos. It's a circus, and it's really hard for the athletes to have much control over their training at that level. You'd be surprised. I mean, Froome can do whatever he wants, I'm sure, but for the rest of the teams, it's, there's interviews, there's massages, you have to hand your bike in because the mechanic needs it, and you have to be here for this dinner and this team thing and this and before you know it, they've got 75 minutes to train. That's it. It's amazing how it flies by.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, that's a different subject, but even during the race. You think pros get to do whatever they want to do and whatever's best for them, but it's often not the case.
Not even close. Not even close.
They're doing interviews. They have a bunch of things, team commitments.
And more pertinently maybe to our audience from a practical standpoint is the same is true, for example, okay, let's look at like an endurance mountain bike race. There are so many logistical details to mind before you're going to go ride your mountain bike hard for 8 hours. The entire day before can easily be consumed with like
stressful
figuring
things.
out raceful food and changing tires and cleaning your bike and replacing that bearing and then having the pre-ride meeting and then trying to get to bed at 8:30 at night because the thing always starts at friggin' 4 a.m. It's like by the time you do that, you barely have time to ride your bike, let alone do openers. I mean, it can be a lot.
Well, you just heard our thoughts about tapering for a tour. Chris caught up with Joe Dombrowski, a world tour rider with EF Education First Strap Pack presented by Cannondale, who talked about his actual experience prepping for the Giro this year. It's definitely a long way away from what the science recommends, but even Joe admits that if he were coaching an amateur for a one-day race, the approach would be very different.
For me, then, in terms of the run into, let's take, for example, the Giro, I typically will do altitude before a Grand Tour. So like, for example, this year it's looked like, this big anaerobic focus, lots of gym work up until about February, and then starting to come with more volume and a little bit more like long sustained efforts. And then I would say the last bit is, especially as a climber focusing on Grand Tours, you need to make sure your weight is where it needs to be. I've had actually good success with, like, in 2016, in this same time frame, I was in Tenerife before the Giro, and I ended up riding a great Giro, and I spent, I think, 17 or 18 days here, and I did maybe 1 or 2 days where I went over 320 watts. So the intensity was actually very low, and I was just riding a lot. And part of that was because I was a bit heavy, and I did need to lose some weight, and it can be a bit dangerous sort of trying to combine altitude training with a lot of volume, with a lot of intensity. It's just like a bit much.
Yeah.
But in general, I found that actually kind of taking out a lot of the intensity in the month before the key races works well for me. And then I just bring in, I might be training 25 to 30 hours a week on the bike, but the intensity in general is pretty low, and the efforts that there are maybe more like sort of medium to like I guess they would sort of look like spike zone 3 type efforts, or like over under threshold type efforts, but not a lot of like real high end stuff.
2 weeks before the Giro starts, or a week out, do you have a time in mind going into a big race where you say, okay, I need to start a taper? Do you have that luxury leading into your target races?
Yes and no. Like, for example, I just finished off a few hard days in Tenerife. I'll do Romandy between now and the Giro, and I kind of end up keeping the volume up maybe more than you'd think. And I think it's kind of one of those things, like, in my experience, the body sort of likes homeostasis. So if you're used to riding a lot of volume, if you just stop, or if you significantly reduce that, I find that I really struggle. Like, and one thing that's, I think, has helped me is I often find it hard to get the power out the first few days of a stage race. And one thing I started doing with JV is usually 2 days before the race, I'll do like 5 to 6 hours, but just easy, like 170 watts, just kind of noodling along. And I found that keeping that volume in there, I tend to have an easier go the first few days when it can be pretty explosive. And then I tend to get better as the race goes on. And even in a Grand Tour, racing the Giro, I'll do my best power numbers in the third week.
I'm sure preparing for a Grand Tour is significantly different than if you're prepping for Liège, for a single day race. Sure.
But even then, you'll see some guys before the classics do a long ride 2 days out. And I think that is, I think some of it is even just like World Tour level riders are used to racing and training at a very high volume. So even things like blood plasma volume, when you go from like a lot of volume to just stopping, then you lose a lot of that. And then when you try and get going again, sometimes you have a hard time like sort of getting the power out. And so I think it's probably more common than you'd think. And I think that's something that you really only see in very high level athletes, because I don't think it's something that works. For example, like if I were coaching a master's rider who's working 40 hours a week and is going to race a criterium on a Saturday, I think in their case, if they're riding maybe 10 hours a week, it's best for them to just go in fresh.
Let's get back to our conversation with Colby and what not to do in a peak.
So we've already talked a bit about some of the what not to do's. And clearly one of them is to get nervous halfway through your taper period and decide that you need to do an hour-long Strava segment or a really hard interval session.
Oh man. Yeah, like I need to cram for this
I'm
exam.
Losing fitness, or yeah, exactly. I haven't done enough, because whatever you've done at that point, the only thing you can do at that point is ruin your race completely by trying to do too much work.
Mm-hmm. Or worse, you're just coming off of that overreach week. You're fatigued. You're not putting out great numbers. So you go, I got to train.
I have to train more. Yes, right. Exactly right. You have to use some baseline of common sense, which means, okay, if I've been doing 20 minutes worth of work on my interval days and I've been doing an hour worth of sweet spot or threshold on my longer days, then I need to cut that by a mathematically sound amount and stick with it and do the best I can on that day. And if the numbers are low, the numbers are low, but I still have another 5 or 8 days until my race and things are going to turn around. And when you get nervous, you put energy into other areas of impacting your recovery.
What are some of the other things that people should definitely not do? Let's get back to
besides
that.
Apocalyptic floods.
Yeah, to live in places without. Yeah.
Well, this does get a bit into my practical tips on how.
Let's do it.
Great. So I have my 6 Colby tips on what to do, or my practical recommendations on how to handle things going into an overload week and a tape and peak cycle.
And this is how professional Colby is. He made this list and he brought it in. I think you are our first guest to come in with notes, with all the notes.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. What an
Setting
honor.
a high standard for the
future podcast guests. Bring notes, or don't. I don't know. So my number one tip and this is, some of these tips apply to both the overloading week and the taper. Some of them apply more just to the taper. This one applies specifically to the taper. Well, no, actually it applies to both. And I'll give Dr. Alan Lim credit for this. He taught me this years ago. I worked with him on and off as a coach for years. And Alan said the number one thing you can do, and this is at the time was supported by the science, the number one thing you can do during a taper period to help improve your performance when you want to peak is get more sleep. Mm-hmm. Sleep is, I think the science pretty clearly shows that sleep is absolutely essential for endurance athletes, unless you have a rare genetic SNP like Jocko Willink and you can sleep 5 hours a day and get up and smash yourself every morning at 4:30 in the morning. For those of you who don't know who Jocko is, just go Google it and have fun. It's an amazing journey. And so sleep, add an hour of sleep, ideally per night in the taper period. That will help your recovery. So many essential biological components of recovery happen during sleep. I can't emphasize it enough. And the easiest and most practical way to do that is to go to sleep an hour earlier than you would normally. So if you are a 10:30 bed person, climb into bed at 9:30. Even if you don't fall asleep at 9:30, that's okay. Just start reading a book with low levels of light and let the magic happen. Let it happen. The second line of defense for that is to sneak a nap in whenever you can. Even if it's a 20-minute nap where you don't actually feel like you sleep at work, you go hide in a broom closet or something, do it. When you get home from work, if you're totally smashed, before you start playing catch with kids and, cleaning up the dog poop and cooking dinner or whatever other random domestic stuff you got to do, sneak in a 20-minute nap. Just make a deal with your partner, offer them something in return. Maybe it's that amazing vacation down the road, but there's got to be give and take. And hopefully your life partners and family understand this goal is important to you. You've been working at it for months, so they should be supportive of you in that perspective. So you might need some help. Sleep is one area where people need help. Ask for help.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two is clear your calendar. Okay. If you are normally training 12 hours a week, and then your coach is going to ask you to do 18 hours a week during your loading week, and then your taper period, this is not the time to go to the dentist. This is not the time to start a new screen door project. This is not the time to finish your taxes. Do that stuff in the other 50 weeks in the year, not these 2 weeks. Okay. Because
life coach Colby comes out.
You're already dealing with you need a clear calendar so you can just relax. And then if you have an extra hour at night, if you're not going to bed early, then you can just do something relaxing. And that time will help you unwind and work towards your goal. You spent months preparing for this event. Don't screw it up in the last week because you accidentally forgot that suddenly you had 3 parties to attend to and a kid's birthday party and, 2 dentist appointments. And then you have to take your dog to the vet to get his teeth cleaned. That can wait a week or 2 weeks, right?
Something I like to do with my athletes is when they're on a recovery week or taper week and they're not training as much, I actually have them schedule the time that they would have trained. And I said,
yes,
you would have been on the bike this time. So we know you have that time.
Yes.
Now it turns into recovery time.
Yes.
Take a nap, do a stretch, do some foam rolling.
Yes.
But that time is still time for you to recover and adapt.
Exactly. I agreed. Number 3 is during that taper period is the time to make lists, be organized, and be professional. That means managing your equipment, take it at a sustainable pace. So if you're preparing again for a mountain bike stage race, that's the time to go check your tires, check your cassette and drivetrain, take your bike to the shop, or do the work yourself, again, at a sustainable pace. So you plan it out in advance. So it's not the night before the race. All of a sudden you're running around, going to the bike shops and stressing out about stuff that could have been done 4 or 5 days ago, right? That's the time to make sure you've got enough chain lube. It's to start going to the grocery store and planning out your list to make your energy bars or do your scratch cookbook or whatever your method is, right? Make sure you got enough energy drink, all those details. That also means that in particular, if your peak event is an event such as a time trial and you're going to be warming up on a trainer, this is the perfect time to rehearse your warm-up routine. Go over it with your coach, know exactly what it is. The more stuff on race day that you have perfectly dialed, the less you have to think, the fewer decisions you have to make, the more in the flow moment you can be, or in the flow during the moment you can be, and that is going to increase the probability of you having a productive race or a race result that you want. So if your warm-up routine is 20 minutes zone 1 building to zone 2 plus a 5-minute progressive plus you practice that once during your taper. Just set up the trainer and that's your intensity for the day. Make sure it works. Try it out. Discuss it with your coach. If you have questions about it, then once you actually do it, then you'll go, oh, well, I guess once I did it, I wasn't sure if I should do another minute in this zone or what. You can iron all that out. Then it's dialed, right? And that's also the time you should have a clear picture what your training is going to be. You should have a plan. Of course, training plans are ideas, and ideas are meant to be toppled over and knocked around and changed based on weather and other things. Especially during a taper week, you need to remain a little bit flexible. Don't be fixated on a certain day. This has to happen, or, it doesn't have to be a crisis if you had a day of motor pacing plan on Wednesday and the pacer can't pace you till Thursday morning. Just work with it. It doesn't have to be day on, day off, right? But have a plan, try to execute it as best you can, and then be flexible with that plan. Number 4 is, we just touched on this a bit. It's really about emphasizing recovery. And I like to title this Yang versus Yin. So you got to kind of consider what you've been doing to your body during training all this time. That's all Yang energy. That's building energy. It's catabolic energy. It's destructive energy. It's also creative energy because you're making and doing things, but it depletes the body, right? When you do a week that is a loading week, that week impacts your system on many different levels. Physically, mentally, spiritually, it drains you, right? It's a lot of energy and output. It's a lot of doing. It's putting on shoes and going out, doing intervals, and then it's recovering and eating and cooking and all those things that go into that sport. So you got to balance that out with activities that allow you to restore energy, replenish energy, moisturize the body, bring energy back in, right? And that's as simple as eating and sleeping in some senses, but in other senses, it can also be things like massage, foam rolling, stretching, Epsom salt baths, magnesium cream, One of my favorites that I've discovered kind of more recently that some of my other athletes have been holding back on me about, float tank. Have you guys ever been to a float tank?
No.
Nope, haven't done one.
All right. So I got to go down a tiny wormhole for a minute. I've been using the Whoop strap for over a year now. The Whoop, for those of you who don't know, it's like a Fitbit, but far more advanced. It's a strap that you wear around your wrist, and it continually measures HRV, or heart rate variability, which is simply the number of microseconds between each heartbeat. And the higher your HRV, the more responsive your nervous system is to the environment. So you quote, want a high HRV when you're recovered. That indicates that you are recovered and that you're responding to environmental stress as well. Or global stress is really the way to think about it. And because you wear the Whoop 24 hours a day, it includes your exercise stress. You're wearing it while you're riding, and it also gives you a sleep score. So it tells you how well you're sleeping. So it's a pretty neat device. There are a few other devices out there that do similar things. I'm not wedded to this one. It's just the one I've been using. I've got some of my athletes on it. I think it's very actionable information because it gives you a recovery score every morning when you wake up that's based on the previous stress scores and your sleep score. And it's a really simple score. It's 1 to 100. 0 to 33 is red. 33 to 66 is yellow. 66 plus is green. So you can really simply say, I'm recovered, or I'm in the middle ground, or maybe I need another nap. Point is, when I used the Whoop and I went to a couple float tank sessions, my HRV shot up. That 90-minute float tank session during the day, then I slept so well that night. We're so chilled out.
Describe this float tank session.
A float tank they used to be called more isolation tanks. Now they're called float tanks. Mm-hmm. It's basically a pod that you climb into. Some more advanced centers will now have a room, but most of them are pods. You climb in there. You have control over your own environmental factors, conditions, but it's filled with about 10 inches of extremely saline water. Mm-hmm. They just basically dump tons and tons of Epsom salt in it, so much so that you float quite easily in that 10 inches of water. So then you can close the pod. If you want to, you can turn off the lights. You have no music if you want, and it is completely dark in there and almost totally silent depending on which tank you're at. Some centers are a little more quiet than others. Don't pick one next to a highway. So you get in there and you just breathe and float and relax.
Without stimulus.
Without
stimulus deprivation.
It is. Yeah, it's a sense. Yeah. Because if you think about it, even when you're sleeping now, you constantly have things assaulting your senses all the time. And when we're out in the world, I mean, between iPhones and people honking at us and everything else going on, there's a lot happening. Your nervous system has to process all that input and information and learn what to ignore and what not to. And that plays a big role on the fatigue levels of a person. So this is an opportunity for you to kind of hit the reset button. And what's amazing about it is a 90-minute session will take seemingly about 45 minutes in your head. Time just flies by and you walk out of there just like a Zen monk. It's incredible.
And you want more.
You want more.
I want one right now.
Yeah, they're amazing. I highly recommend people trying checking it out if you haven't had one.
Do they have any of these things outside of Boulder County?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, this is a thing.
All right.
Not only in the Republic of Boulder, a.k.a. the fairy bubble as we call it. So this taper period is a great time to, just like you mentioned earlier, you schedule time for your clients that would have been training time. Now that time is float tank time or massage time, or maybe it's just foam roller time or stretching, gentle stretching. This is not the time to do a brand new super hot yoga class where you're going to pull a hammy or a groin or something. We want to maximize your replenishing energy during this period so that you are as recovered as possible going into that event. So if you are an athlete who gets nervous, or you have an athlete you're coaching and you have an athlete who tends to get nervous during their taper because they're getting itchy and they want to train a little more, have them put that constructive energy into actively making themselves recovered. If you go to the line 100%, no fatigue in your muscles, fully filled with glycogen, nervous system is ready to rock, you're just going to have the best race of your life. And that's what we want, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. I think you also touched on, you might get, this might be one of your next bullets, but the importance of don't be trying things you don't know or that are new to you on a week of a taper.
On a week of a taper, yep.
This is where you want to be a boring person doing what you know.
Yes, agreed. Yep. Not the time to be like, oh, maybe I could go do a set of 20 back squats. Give me that extra boost. Right. No experimentation this week. And that goes for cleats and pedals, by the way. Right? So if your cleats and pedal, this is a common one I see as a bike fitter. People come in, oh, my knee's a little niggled. First thing I check. Oh, hey, guess what? Your cleats are smoked and your pedals are smoked because you left it way too long. And now you've got this medial chain collapse and you're pronating a little bit and boom, knee issue or back issue, right? Pretty common. So the day after your loading week is when I recommend, if your cleats and pedals need to be changed, that's the closest you would do it to your race. So if you're on a 7-day taper, you've got several rides still to make sure that everything's in the right place and that things are dialed and things don't go weird. That'd be as close as I would recommend you put new equipment on. And as far as other stuff goes, it should have been done before that.
Right. Do not change these things the day before a race.
Right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. The next one kind of goes into the float tank department a little bit and also touches on what we just touched about, which is not trying anything new. But my recommendation is meditation. This is definitely outside the sphere for some people. So
we've been waiting a long time for this.
bear with
Colby.
me. So
Candles? Any candles involved?
candles can be involved, whatever gets the job done. You know, in the last few years as a coach, I've really been craving intellectual stimulation and the ability to kind of serve my clients better. And one of the best, most effective ways for me to consume information and learn new things is through podcasts. So I've been consuming a lot of podcasts in the last probably 4 years now. And one of my favorites is Tim Ferriss. And this guy's massively popular. If you haven't heard of him, I recommend you go check out his website. It's a giant infomercial. Just wade through that stuff. He really has good intent in my experience and in my opinion. And what Tim does is he interviews experts across all walks of life. Business, sports, psychology, comedians. He's interviewed Jamie Foxx. He's interviewed Arnold Schwarzenegger, anyone who's world class at what they do. And one of the things Tim likes to do is boil it down to what all these world class people have in common, what their common behaviors are. And one of them across the board, the striking common denominator is meditation. Meditation is immensely popular amongst people who are really, really good at what they do. So that alone is a compelling argument that you should at least consider it or try it in your life.
Now, what form of meditation?
Well, that is kind of up to the individual to explore. I mean, and there are all kinds of apps and things you can use to get you started. The important part is you start to explore and figure it out. I've used a program called Ziva Mind. But really, what is meditation fundamentally? It's cleaning out the trash. Our minds are filled with clouds, and the clouds go by, and sometimes the clouds are happy white clouds, but many times
Storm clouds.
they're storm clouds. And these clouds collect in your skull, and they can influence your perspective and their negative thoughts about whether it's about yourself, whether it's about other people, whether it's about the guy who just cut you off, or whether it's negative self-talk about I'm not good enough, right? This touches on
Or I didn't do the right preparation.
I didn't do the right
or you start
preparation. My training wasn't
second-guessing.
hard enough. Right. Oh, this guy is doing this time trial this week and I'm not doing that. Why do I need to do that? Did I not train enough? This is just negative self-talk, and meditation helps to clear the mind of that self-talk and give you a blank slate. We've all been on this planet for, well, at least a decade and a half, 2-3 decades. It's
20
a lot
to
of
100 years.
Right. In some cases, you've got many decades of old thoughts that are collecting like old kind of dusty furniture in your attic, and you've got to clean out that attic so that you can have a clear mind and clear intent when you go into your sport. And it just promotes health. And that's ultimately our goal, right? And then the last point that I'd love to suggest to people is this should be a lifestyle practice more than anything, but a taper time is a great time to sort of double down on it. And that is clean air, clean food, and clean water. You need to aggressively protect your own personal environment. If you're the type of rider who goes on the Wednesday night group ride or whatever, does your Thursday lunch ride and you go hard, and then you come home after you finish your day of work and you knock back a couple cold beers, the taper week is the time to reconsider that behavior. And I can tell you specifically using the Whoop that alcohol in particular is one thing that definitely has a negative effect on HRV and sleep score. You can see it clearly. So if you check out their site, you'll see a lot of people say, oh yeah, I quit drinking since I used the Whoop. Because you see the negative feedback immediately. You can see it quantifiably in your HRV. But taper week is a great time to not gorge yourself on chocolate cake, not have a lot of refined foods. If you take the 30,000 foot view at most of the science I've seen, nearly everyone, regardless of what type of diet you follow or what you think what diet will best serve your individual body type or phenotype, the common denominator between most of the science shows that if you include more vegetables, you are healthier. Vegetables, vegetables, vegetables. Fill your plate with vegetables and then decide on the other stuff after that. Carbs are important for elite athletes, but high quality food, high quality clean water, clean air. These are important things to look after in your taper period and also for your overall health. So be conscious of that, cultivate that lifestyle, and that will serve you to the end. Because as Paul Chek would say, sooner or later, health will be everyone's priority. You can either make it a priority now or it will become your priority later in life.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Trevor, give us your quick 1 minute, this is what peaking is all about, take home.
So as you saw, it's a little bit gray. There probably isn't one particular format that fits everybody, but I would say general rules, you need some sort of big fatiguing week to taper down from. That's usually going to be about 2 weeks out from the event. When you are tapering, you need to keep the intensity up, bring the volume down. As you saw, there's a lot of debate on how much you bring that volume down. And then that week before the event is when you have to be kind of a bit of a monk. Make sure you're getting your recovery. Make sure you're doing everything right. You're eating right. Show up to your event ready. And I know you're going to have a lot to add to that, so I'll say just those little bit. And I guess the last thing I'll add is don't try to extend that peak 4 weeks.
Yeah. That's a great framework. Yeah, I would just add to what you said. I mean, thinking about like our concepts of clearing the calendar, for example, and emphasizing recovery off the bike, you got to think backwards from the line. So if your race is on the 30th of the month, as early as the 7th of that month, you're going to be starting your loading week. Well, guess what? During your loading week, that's going to be an extra percentage, whatever that is, 15, 20, 30% volume or intensity on top of your normal load. So that means you've already got to clear your calendar then because you're not going to have time to do anything else. There are no dog appointments that week. You're going to be sleeping, training, working, and doing essential family activities, whatever those may be, right? Cooking and et cetera. So, and dealing and putting out fires. You know, if you get a flat tire in your car, obviously that can't wait 3 weeks. I would say it's a lot about planning, and it's also about sort of taking a moment to understand the commitment of a true peak. And then again, having a conversation and hopefully the support of your family and loved ones, because they need to be on board with you on this. It's something that's going to impact your life off the bike as well as on. So it's really important to make sure they're on the same page and that they're supportive. And you know what? A great way to frame that conversation is, sweetheart, I have a proposition for you. And that proposition may involve a vacation or some alone time, or the calendar's cleared so that your significant other can do what their goals are at some other point in the year. And you will then do all the cooking and most of the dishes and for that period of time, right? That's respectful and fair. So you got to plug all that equation in. It can't just be me all the time.
The one thing I would add to that, I guess, would be trust the process. Commit to it and don't start second guessing halfway through. Don't ramp it up because you think you've done too little. Stick to the plan, trust the process, and that's what
Agreed.
That's what the peak should be.
Yeah. There's a good probability that at some moment you will second guess the process. That's the time to remember. I plan this out. I know what I'm doing. I'm going to call my coach, or if you don't have a coach, you're just going to say, this is my plan, and I'm going to stick with it, good or bad, and I'll learn from it, because chances are you're going to have many other opportunities to peak. So
you get weird feelings, weird things happen to your body during that whole peak and taper phase. So you have to look long term.
Yep.
Thank you, Colby Pearce. That was an excellent discussion. Thanks for joining us. We hope to have you back again to talk about soup and sensory deprivation pods and many other topics. It was wonderful talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. It was an honor to be here.
That was another episode of Fast Talk. As always, we love your feedback. Email us at fasttalk@velonews.com. Subscribe to Fast Talk on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Be sure to leave us a rating and a comment. While you're there, check out our sister podcast, the Velo News Podcast, which covers news about the week in cycling. Become a fan of Fast Talk on Facebook at facebook.com/velonews and on Twitter at twitter.com/velonews. Fast Talk is a joint production between Velo News and Connor Coaching. The thoughts and opinions expressed in Fast Talk are those of the individual. For Chris Case, Colby Pearce, Joe Dombrowski, and the illustrious Mr. Pickles, I'm Trevor Connor. Thanks for listening.